Welcome everybody, and just to let you know that this webinar is recorded. So thanks to all of you, for joining this webinar on AgTech Harnessing Technologies for Sustainable Food and Agriculture System, a sector deep dive by IFC and the World Bank. So that's the title of today's webinar. Let me start by saying that data-driven and digital agriculture is a high priority for the agriculture and food global practice, of which I'm the global director, as of course, all the units and parts of the bank as well, IFC. This is a joint webinar. But let me just reflect a little bit upon it. Why it is a priority. First, it's related, of course, to the potential of digital technologies and the role they can play in making a difference in many aspects of the food systems transformation that we're talking about. Food systems transformation in support of healthy people, healthy planet, and a healthy economy. Digital cuts across, those three dimensions of food systems transformation. Now, think about, traceability systems and what that means for food safety. And of course, there's a clear link, with healthy people. Think about sensors, precision farming, improving input use efficiency, which is important for improving resilience, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and clearly there's a link, with healthy planets. And then, of course, the role that digital technologies plays in e-commerce, market transparency, etc., etc. So thereby having a link with healthy economy. So the potential and the trends-cutting potential of data-driven and digital agriculture for food system transformation, is one reason why it is a priority. I think the second reason is, the question is, if digital offers so much potential, how then we can make sure that smallholder farmers actually benefit from this, and do not end up, and clearly there's a risk, do not end up on the wrong side of the digital divide. I think that is also motivating a lot of attention of us, to this issue of data-driven and digital agriculture. And thirdly, the effects of COVID-19. COVID-19 has accentuated the importance, because if COVID-19 has made clear, the vulnerability of many agriculture supply chains, and therefore, has generated a lot of interest in digital solutions actually to build more resilience in those supply chains. So those are a few reflections why this is important to us. Also, I would like to mention that, we did a flagship report on digital transformation of the agriculture and food system last fiscal year. It was launched and distributed in March this year, generating a huge audience, more than 17,000 people. So one of the best attended World Bank events. But this also positions the bank and the agriculture food global practice very well in moving, this agenda forward. And of course, the great news is that we see also a rapid uptake, of data-driven and digital agriculture in our projects. So far, we already see in 13 operations across the various regions, and that reflects about $1.1 billion in investments of projects that include activities and components. Support our data platform, digitization of farmer registries, e-vouchers, innovation ecosystems, etc., etc. And then, of course, there are a lot of hackathons going on, innovation challenges, to help developing the innovation ecosystem. And this is a business line in itself. And we recently had one in Indonesia, which actually was very well attended. Minister of Finance, Minister of Finance, Minister of Agriculture. A lot of traction there. Now, also, it's great to see that data-driven and digital agriculture is getting the attention of bank senior management, and also our board of executive directors is taking notice. And this is what today's webinar is about, as we are discussing the sector deep dive that was done earlier this year. This was a joint effort by IFC and the Agriculture and Food Global Practice, along with other support, I mean, from colleagues across the bank, I mean, digital development, finance, competitiveness and innovation, etc. That deep dive was very well received by the board, and I think we had a great discussion and clearly an endorsement and direction for the bank to move forward on this agenda. The webinar is part of the World Bank's What's Cooking Digital Agriculture Learning Series. So this webinar series is available on our digital agriculture websites. I mean, you can see it on the screen. And participant might find a link at the bottom of the announcement. I mean, so you can click on that. Now, when it comes to the flow of today's webinar, so we first have a joint presentation of the deep dive by Prasad Gopalan, who is the Global Sector Manager for Agribusiness and Forestry at the IFC, and Parmesh Shah, who is a global lead in the Agriculture and Food Global Practice for data-driven and digital agriculture. So we have this presentation first, which then will take about 25 minutes. And then following the presentation, we have two discussants who make some interventions. And I will introduce, I mean, the two discussants before they take the screen. And then following the discussions, discussants, we will then have a Q&A session that's open to all. As a point of order, please do not interrupt, I mean, the speakers and the discussants, I mean, when they are presented and speaking, but you can type in actually a question in the chat window, and then we will answer, I mean, those questions that you put in the chat window as part of the Q&A session. We have a few colleagues actually monitoring the chat window. Of course, also at the Q&A session, you will have an opportunity to ask questions directly, but we will start with the questions put forward in the chat window. So I really encourage everybody during the presentations and during the intervention of the discussants, I mean, to put your questions in the chat window. Okay, I think with that introductory remarks and the on how we organize ourselves for this webinar today, I can now hand it over to Prasad and to Parmesh for the presentation. So over to you guys.
Martin, Abdul, who is the strategy officer in IFC, will talk briefly about the deep dives, and then Prasad and I'll take over, if that's okay with you.
Okay, very good. That's very, so over to you, Abdul. Abdul, are you there? I see your name.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Martin.
And we also see you. Welcome, Abdul. Good to have you.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so thanks for that excellent introduction. So here I'll start off the slides with the team just to tell you a little bit of an intro into the sector deep dives. So for those who may not be as familiar with the sector deep dives, they are a diagnostic and business development tool that allow IFC to identify a roadmap for sector engagement and to articulate it to our board. There are two aspects of the sector deep dives I would like to share with you. Could you please mute everyone? So the first aspect is the proven analytical framework. Back in 2017, IFC, with the help of McKinsey & Company, started the sector deep dives initiative. And the three basic things each sector deep dive tries to answer are: first, why are we engaged in a particular sector?
In FY in 2022, and then 100% in 20.
Sorry, somebody is speaking. Can everybody check their microphone, please? Thank you. Back to you, Abdul.
Thank you. So the first question we try to answer through a sector deep dive is: why are we engaged in a particular sector? What is our vision and strategy for this sector? And then third, how are we going to operationalize this strategy vis-a-vis IFC 3.0? So while the sector deep dives are owned and come from the industry teams themselves, the role of corporate strategy in all of this is to help facilitate the entire strategy development process so that industry teams can continue focusing on their business goals. And there are 5 elements that corporate strategy brings to bear. The first is analysis and execution. We carry out a lot of research and things like global trends and identification. Second is planning and process management, where we try to define goals, milestones, allocate activities and tasks. Third is meeting facilitation, where we try to set agendas and contents for meetings. In this case, for AgTech, we did a lot of this jointly with the World Bank. Fourth is communication and storylining, trying to develop the presentation, key messages, and summary memos. And last is knowledge management, things like best practices, lessons learned, and of which this webinar actually fits very nicely into that last piece. And then at the bottom, I just want to share with you the sort of the milestones or the process of which a deep dive goes through. So these are just very high level processes, but the first is developing a scope document, which is essentially a sort of outline. Next is to have a kick-off meeting. The kick-off meeting will take place most likely with the key internal stakeholders. We'll have a vision workshop where we talk about the why section, the prioritization workshop as well. In this case, for AgTech, we merged both processes, both workshops into one. And then we had the external interviews. This is a key part, it's becoming more and more of a prominent part of the deep dives, where we reach out to external experts. Some of those experts actually are on this call today, so thank you for joining. And we get external feedback that feeds into the sector deep dives. Then we have the management sign off. And then finally, the delivery of the deep dive in the form of a board's technical briefing. That whole process takes about 7 months. And then next, I'd like to share with you just, Martin touched a little bit on this already, but I just want to talk a little bit about it. This is a very consultative process internally within the World Bank, where we had various teams like the IFC MAS team, which is the manufacturing and agriculture agribusiness team. We had the disruptive tech team heavily involved. Also, our colleagues from sector economics, our colleagues from the World Bank AgriGP also heavily involved on a weekly basis, blended finance, climate business, and then of course the external consultants. And then at various points, we had the IFC and World Bank senior leadership also involved. And then of course, the IFC corporate strategy team that facilitated the process throughout from beginning to the end. And this is just to give you a flavor of how internally consultative this process was, as well as reaching out to external experts. Thank you. And with that, I would like to hand over to Prasad.
So, look, our presentation was kind of divided into why, what, and how, the way Abdul kind of, he has a cookie cutter approach and from our strategy group in terms of how these deep dives go. So maybe we should just go to the next slide, Abdul, as to why.
Prasad, could you speak a little bit louder?
Maybe my microphone is hidden. Okay. Is that okay?
Oh.
All right. So look, why are we looking at AgTech now, right? So, the World Bank and IFC's strategic engagement in the agricultural sector, because it impacts neither of the 17 SDGs and impacts indirectly much more, almost every single SDG, is enshrined in our strategy. The World Bank has a Food Systems 2030 strategy as well as IFC's agribusiness strategic action plan. It kind of lays out what we want to do in the space more strategically as it impacts the SDGs. And within that space, increasingly over the last, especially decade, we've seen how AgTech, the development of technology as it applies to agriculture and agribusiness, can improve not only, at productive solutions. You're looking at improving productivity on the farm. It actually minimizes resource use. It helps in bringing efficiencies across the food value chain, not just all the way from inputs to distribution and retail. Connecting smallholders to markets more transparently, providing financial solutions that are more accessible to smallholders especially. And more importantly, technology has a very interesting way of addressing the impact of agriculture on the planetary resources, right? As well as the impact of climate and other aspects on agriculture. So it has developed. I think technology has evolved to a certain level that it can be extremely well applied to the sectors that we operate in. Next slide, please. So, obviously agriculture and agribusiness and food systems are not without challenges. So these are some of the challenges that we think are easily addressable by the use of technology as it's evolved to today's environment, right? So obviously agricultural productivity, you still see fragmented land holdings and various other issues. I'll come to that in a second. Various issues contribute to low productivity, especially in large parts of Africa. So how can we use technology to address these issues? Access to finance. Access to finance for smallholders is still a major issue. I think this is something where this is across most smallholder economies. So Africa, Asia, for example, are still dramatically, there is very low penetration of finance for smallholders. And if it is so, it is at a very expensive proposition for these farmers. Again, food losses is a proxy to supply chain efficiency. We all know, 30 to 35% of food is wasted or lost during post-production and till it reaches the consumer. So there's a significant supply chain efficiency that can be brought about by deploying technologies. And finally, the climate change, impact of climate change on agriculture and the impact of ag on climate, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, etc. Right? And these are especially important in the belt around the tropics and the subtropics, where you have significant impact of ag on climate. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, right, so you have low productivity, you have supply chain inefficiencies, the lack of access to finance. It's not just finance, but broadly look at risk management and finance as a bucket. Lack of access to that can be addressed, as well as environmental stress and climate change. These are the 4 buckets that we're looking at where technology can play a major role. And some of these are interlinked, right? So if you look at solutions that can use technologies to address greenhouse gas emissions, for example, in rice cultivation, feeds back into productivity as well, and minimizing resource use for it. So there are some of these technologies are actually cross-cutting, and they're not only digital, but they're also fundamental technologies that are being developed. For example, on soil health improvement, you have companies that are emerging that can produce products, especially biological products for seed coating, depending upon the microbiome that exists in soils, right? So there are interesting technologies that are being evolved, not only in developed markets, which is where most of the investments have gone to date, but also in markets in which we operate, Brazil, India, and places that are actually generating some interesting propositions to solve some of the issues that we are seeing on this slide in the 4 buckets. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you a sense, right, how the space has evolved, the application of technology has evolved, and the breadth of technologies that are available to actually be applied to our space, to the agriculture and agribusiness space. So the evolution of satellite and imagery, data management and e-commerce, artificial intelligence and interpreting the data, predictive analytics, supply chain management. It's not just supply chain management, but technology for using, innovative products, for example, coatings to reduce spoilage, for example. Robotics, you see the cost of drone sensors and robotics, and even satellite imagery to a certain extent has been deployed for orchard management, for example, high value crop management. So, and these are coming to a price point. All these elements are coming to a price point where we think it can be deployed even at a smallholder level. I think that's the challenge that we face in terms of how adoption can be fostered through the use of technology and make it available and at reach for these smallholders, especially in our markets at scale. That seems to be one of the this is a feedback that we heard from many of our external partners, and that seems to be kind of the threshold challenge that we have faced. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch upon, why do we want to get into this space, right? So of course, the world is going towards this direction, and I think we see the logic as to how it actually influences the development of the food systems as a whole in terms of efficiency, productivity, etc. But why are we, I'll talk about IFC, the World Bank. Parmesh will come in and say a few words about how the World Bank engages the private sector and their role in the in addressing this challenge across the public sector interface that they have. Whereas I'll just say a few words about where IFC fits in, right? We're by far the most active multilateral organization in the agribusiness space. We have about $4 billion of our portfolio in agribusiness is close to $3.5–4 billion, right? And this leads us to a rich pool of clients who can actually test technologies. That's the mainstream clients that can use these technologies and kind of it's a proof of concept, if you may, in many cases, that they can actually bring out these technologies and the applicability of these kinds of things. The other aspect is that we have our own investments. We can invest in technology companies directly. AgTech firms, we're doing that, is one of our pillars of our venture capital investments. But we can also partner with other players, venture capital funds, private sector players, mainstream players who are deploying technologies to kind of reach areas that we can't reach individually, right, as an institution. So that allows us, we have a kind of a product suite that actually helps us invest and co-invest with partners in addressing the capital needs for some of these companies in deploying technology. And of course, as a group, Martin's group at the bank and our group at the IFC, we're increasingly joined at the hip, right? So to the extent that we can address solutions on a more comprehensive fashion, I think it presents a very significant opportunity, especially in markets that are actually less developed. They're nascent or emerging markets, where they're emerging markets in terms of technology development. So that's on the kind of investment side. And then on the knowledge, we have a very active advisory program that we deploy in many countries, especially in countries which are at the earliest stage of development and technology, where we've actually tested, interestingly, concepts from other emerging market countries and bringing technology from there, which can be adapted and implemented at a very cost-effective fashion. A case in point is Ethiopia, where we're looking at our advisory services colleagues are deploying technology in a large way to develop their commodity markets, production as well as distribution and sale of commodities within Ethiopia, using technology as a tool. That's one major aspect, and it's a vertical that we're focusing in on our advisory engagements. And not just to bring in technology, but also to actually bring technology to our mainstream partners. We're seeing more and more use of technology in our mainstream clients, whether it be digital finance, traceability, improving productivity, minimizing impact on biodiversity, forest loss, etc. So all these are elements that we can bring with our advisory colleagues working with these mainstream clients in adopting technologies. So I just wanted to bring in Parmesh to give a quick view on the bank side, because we think the partnership is very unique.
Thanks, Prasad. And I think that the bank side, we have been investing in a lot of what I would call is the physical side of the phyto-digital infrastructure policy and all, because we invest a lot in productivity improvement, infrastructure, farmer organizations, and a lot of enabling policies for agriculture. Because if agriculture policies in input and output markets are not well developed, it's very difficult to develop an ecosystem there. So we are currently almost, our last year's lending was around $5 billion, which is annual lending is now $5 billion, which is quite significant now, considering the global public good investment which is there. And increasingly what we find, as Martin mentioned, that 13 of these projects, which are about $1 billion, have included significant components on data, digitization, and innovation ecosystem, so that we are building an architecture which allows us to work with the vibrant AgTech sector as we go forward. Data is very important, because we have found that all the AgTechs have told us that startups have told us they spend 70% time on collecting data, and because it's not available to them in a form in which they could immediately develop products and services. So they spend only 30% time on products and services, and it takes them time to reach scale. So we want to remove all the bottlenecks which are the enablers. So the data policy, access, and available to AgTechs in a more seamless kind of way. Second is the digitization, like farm registries and all. If that's digitized, then it's easier for the startups to work on that. And the final part is also the innovation ecosystem, because innovation ecosystem in Africa and many countries we work is still not very developed. That enabling ecosystem investment is also very important. So we can clearly see this part that every government now is saying that can we develop data, digitization, and innovation ecosystem as the core investment as part of the public good, so that the private good starts from a different starting point and it becomes more enabling investment for both IFC to come in, but for other people like Mark and others who are leading these funds which are dedicated to AgTech can also grow much faster through that route. In the knowledge front, we are really stepping up our work, and even the webinar we are doing is now 51st in the series. So we bring in a lot of people together so that the government, public sector, private sector, and all are engaged all the time. And we are creating new ways of doing it. We are also trying to set up some kind of a data observatory globally, so that all the 12 or 13 major databases come together, and then we are able to develop a platform which is accessible at the country level to do that. And finally, the partnership with technical companies like Microsoft and all, because and we are working with Google X and lots of others also. So the technology companies, data companies, AgTech companies create an ecosystem and a platform to do that, and the knowledge on that, advisory on that, and capacity on that. And we are running a very big course now with Open Learning Campus of the bank for all the governments who want to go into this there. So over to you, Prasad. Back to you.
Thanks, Ramesh. Look, I think it depends upon the kind of the markets in which we operate. I think there are tailored solutions. We'll come to that in a second, where the bank may take the lead in certain cases, and then we have the private sector coming in after that, and where in other cases the markets are reasonably well developed, that we have a thriving AgTech space where we can actually leverage the environment to make investments directly. This is a very active collaboration, and we're trying to explore areas where, especially in these kind of nascent markets, where we can actually look at innovation as in the AgTech space, innovation, whether it's in the form of accelerators or otherwise. So it's a very interesting kind of joint effort in those kinds of areas. So next slide, please, Abdul. So what are we doing? So this it may be very trivial to most people who are looking at it, but this represents, it's not just about agriculture, right? Developing an AgTech sector, well-functioning AgTech sector, it's not just about agriculture. It has various elements that need to come together. So you obviously need to have, fundamentally, which is why I think this is the issue of working together with the bank on the public sector side and the public goods side, and the private sector makes sense. Fundamentally, you need on the base, you need fundamentally sound agricultural policies, as well as digital infrastructure policies. I think one of the major issues that we're facing, for example, many of our regions are looking at digitization as a theme going forward. And one of the issues is lack of access. I think even the US, Biden's new plan has major, expenditures in rural infrastructure, especially in terms of digital infrastructure. So this is a basic requirement that we need to have to develop a viable space, AgTech space, and well-functioning space. And of course, you need to have fundamental ag foundations in these countries, right, as well as digital infrastructure and access to digital skills. So we can't force a country to be competitive if you don't have the right resources or land or the enabling attributes, labor capital and knowledge. It's not going to be a conducive space to actually develop a sound production base, for example. So that goes without saying, but I think that's a fundamental aspect. You can't impose the technology layer on top of something that is uncompetitive. So that goes without saying, but we just thought to be good to explicitly state that, right? So, and of course, the digital infrastructure and skills. I think these are, the reach, the ability to learn. And I think on our advisory side, as I mentioned, there's a lot of kind of knowledge training that is being done on digital skills, especially at the smallholder level, especially with women and smallholders. So those are kind of the second level of basic requirements. And of course, on top, the technological entrepreneurship, the ecosystem that exists, from an entrepreneurship perspective, from an R&D perspective, innovation, whether you have appropriate risk capital available to support companies in a very early stage, like accelerators, like even angel investors, and then you have obviously the venture capital outfits that take early risks, and financial institutions that actually can come on the back of early stage investments and support these companies while they grow. So I think these are kind of the elements of kind of a cross-sectoral elements that are needed for what we think a thriving AgTech sector needs to have as building blocks. Next slide, please. So based on those building blocks, right, we kind of did a composite map of the world to kind of differentiate countries from a nascent kind of a market to a more intermediate and advanced market, because those need different types of interventions, right? So in areas where you have very low, for example, you take Brazil. I know, I think from an emerging market perspective, I think India has received more investments than any other, maybe China, but India has received more investments in the AgTech space than even the whole of Latin America, for example, which is an ag powerhouse. But some of the elements need to be right? And that's what we tried to kind of create a composite map of the world using those building blocks to see how we need to kind of develop a framework for interventions in various countries at various states of development. So from the nascent, which is in the light colored area, to more advanced regions, which have different sets of interventions that we can contemplate between the bank and IFC. Next slide, please. So maybe I'll hand this over to Parmesh, and I'll come back on what IFC is doing here. Maybe Parmesh, why don't you, if you want to take the lead?
Sure. So based on what Prasad is saying, so we have really now, when we go to a country, we look at what stage the country is in, because what we do in that country will depend on that, where we are, because there might be some enabling things we might have to do before we start investing in the sector. And there could be a lot of ecosystem building, market development activities we might have to do in different contexts. So I'm just showing the Kenya as an example, where also we are actively involved in investing, both from the bank side and the IFC side, basically. And we are looking at all these things because you need a basic level of tech entrepreneurship. Like Kenya, if you look at it, the M-Pesa and the payment platform was invested some time back. And that laid the foundation for the AgTech and FinTech to grow in Kenya. If we didn't have that foundation of a telecom company doing payment systems, then it would have been very difficult to come up with an AgTech layer on top of it. And so this framework, it's not a cut and dry thing. It's based on some indicators, secondary data and all that, but it gives us a good framework on how should we invest in future. Abdul, the next, please. So just to show you how it exemplifies of this new strategy which World Bank and IFC are developing, how it works in a. So World Bank, we have supported development of a big data platform where all the technologies and all the data, like the farmer registries and all, are now available. Weather data also. There is a micro weather data observatory. All this data is now available, which is now accessible to AgTech startups, to private sector, to public sector, so that they can take their decisions faster and the rate of product development increases there. We also have worked on institutional reform between the Ministry of Agriculture, which has a transformation office, with the chief digital officer in the Ministry of Agriculture. We are seeing that happening in India also now, having a chief data officer finally after a long time. But Kenya had it before India, actually. So I think this institutional reform in which Agriculture Ministry starts looking at the foundational work of how to transformation will happen through data and digital technologies is very important. We have supported the Kenyan government to undertake that reform. Also, we have tried to develop the demand side by supporting a 1 million farmer platform where we aggregate, we also mobilize 1 million farmers to receive these technologies. And we have now a platform in which it's written 15 because an old slide. We have now 26 startups on that platform, basically, who are working with million farmers, because acquiring farmers also is a large cost. Data and acquiring farmers. If public sector does aggregation through farmer organizations and all, and makes it accessible on a public-private platform, the cost of acquiring new people for digital technologies goes down considerably. So we feel that data, digitization, and making these aggregation investments makes it simpler. So last mile service delivery, right? Currently, we expect that in 2 years, we will have million farmers in Kenya covered through these startups and technologies. The things which we thought would take 5 to 6 years is happening now in 2 years because of those enabling investments there. And we also are developing partnership with Microsoft. Their whole Africa program is doing digital internship, by which a lot of young people are joining both the startups and private sector. There are a lot of platforms like Azure and all, where they're developing customized platforms for startups to be able to use those platforms. So because we think that technology companies, data companies, and also agribusiness companies will have to work on. And we work with Mercy Corp's AgriFin Accelerate program, which really is like developing a dedicated accelerator for AgTech startups in Africa. And I'll now hand over to Prasad for talking a little bit about what they are doing by supporting Twiga.
Yeah, so, you saw, Parman, I think there's a deep engagement on the public sector side to create the enabling environment and for companies like Twiga to flourish, right? To start up and flourish. So Twiga is a supply chain aggregator principally, and it connects. Kind of now they become a distribution B2B distribution company. B2B is a pretty the loose word here, because the businesses that they cater to are these mom and pop retailers, street vendors of fruits, vegetables, and other commodities, right? So the company, IFC made an investment in this platform, which uses basically mobile technology to link at the highest level, linking farmers to consumers, and in a very efficient way. And we've actually just committed a risk sharing arrangement with the local bank to support the longer term needs of the farmers, which are part of this network, to supply, to actually invest in their farms to be more productive and produce the desired quality of products. So we're looking at financing those farmers using the platform as a mechanism for finding markets for their products. And we are also looking at, our advisory services colleagues are helping with the training, developing local entrepreneurs, as well as a pool of ag extension service folks who can actually deliver value for these farmers to develop the right methods, using precision ag and things like those, deploying technology as well at the farm level. The important element is that Kenya is still it's not a fully developed market, right? So we also, given the risks involved in the platform, we also brought we have access to pool of funding, which can actually mitigate certain risks that we take in these kinds of early stage investments. So we were able to take a sliver of funding, grant funding that is available to take care of certain risks that we saw in the supply chain, and which will be weaned off over time as Twiga develops their platform and the risks become lower. So kind of a incentive-based subsidy that we're looking at, because we do see some of these risks are insurmountable at the beginning, and we need to have some incentives for these companies to move along those those directions to reduce the risk for external financiers to come in, especially if you want to tap into working capital from creditors, which ultimately is what makes a company grow. Capital can only take it so far, and you need to have access to different forms of capital, including debt, that makes the company grow and make a much bigger impact. So,
can you speed up the presentation a little bit, because it's 9:45, so I want to make sure we have time for the discussions and the Q&A. So thanks.
Parmesh, over to you.
Thanks a lot. So basically, we are looking now at what are we trying to do now. I'll be very fast there. I think we are trying to accelerate the adoption and extension of technology for productivity, efficiency, and resilience of value chains and food systems in emerging markets. That's our vision. That's where we want to go. And there are 4 pillars there. One is the whole productivity pillar, because lots of work we still need to do to increase smallholder and other productivity. The second pillar is the supply chain linkage and efficiency improvement, which includes traceability, logistics, e-commerce, and all the other things. The third is the access to finance and insurance services, which I think are going to be very important if we want to expand the whole AgTech sector. And finally, it's the whole issue of the ESG, the health, environmental, and climate aspects, because climate is going to be the big thing. And I think the AgTech can play a very big role there, including healthier biological alternatives, the climate smart practices there. Let's go now, next slide. Yeah. So basically, that's how we are now looking at. We're looking at in the nascent and basic markets, we will invest a lot through public sector interventions, which are the enablers, which are basically will help us develop the preconditions for private sector investment, and which will include also the regulatory frameworks, the basic infrastructure, digital public goods, and accelerating the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And Prasad, over to you to talk about what will happen in intermediate and advanced markets and how IFC will approach this.
Sure. So it's just, for us, we follow the bank on these nascent and basic markets, and primarily through our advisory services, where we can test some models and pilot some models, as well as we have a new upstream group that looks at early pilots that can form the basis of future engagements on a mainstream basis. So we look at those as our key ways of engaging in these nascent and basic markets, and also advisory tests models from other more developed markets, especially emerging market countries, where we can actually transplant some or adapt some of these models to the countries that we're looking at from a nascent and basic perspective. And in intermediate and advanced markets, I think we're much more nuanced in terms of we can directly invest in companies, in AgTech companies. We can invest in companies that are actually using digital technologies in their mainstream activities. Many companies in Brazil are doing that. Investing through funds that we're looking at. We're not very active in that space, but I think with AgTech, we need to learn a little bit more. So investing in funds does give us that opportunity to reach as well as learn about the space a little bit more, especially at the localized level. And of course, we bring in partners, crowd in other partners, including donors as well as other DFIs to the platforms that we are looking at in terms of investing. Okay, but that I just wanted to give you a sense. I think it's very graduated, and it applies the cascade in a nice way in terms of where we can focus, where the bank can focus, take the lead, and where IFC can actually go and intervene in the markets where we don't need that much support on the public sector side. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm just going to start this, and then Parmesh can this is the last slide, so he can end it. So how do we want to engage, right? So, in certain areas, obviously, we're going to work jointly with the bank. We will, the World Bank AgGP, Martin's group, and IFC's Manufacturing, Agri, and Services group will jointly work on certain areas which are of high priority, where we can apply this, the cascade, where you need both the bank's work and bring in examples where IFC can invest and have the private sector engagement through the IFC angle. We also don't want to be tied in all our efforts, so we do have to have separate but systematic. We coordinate at the top and figure out where we want to engage. The World Bank can do its work, and then IFC can do its own work as well. So but we need to know what each other is doing so that we don't kind of, we don't get into situations where there are subsidies provided and then there are complaints from the private sector that, there's systemic issues developing because of our engagement. And then, of course, we always do demand-driven, especially from an IFC perspective. There are demand-driven market engagements that we do. And what we, just from an IFC perspective, we're also investing, interestingly, in developed country models where we can actually adapt. And the interest from these companies is to take them to markets. Of course, you need a lot of adaptation. So that's something that we're looking at, because a lot of these players are interested in exploring markets, especially in Latin America or Asia. So Africa is the final frontier for them. But I think over time, that's what we're hoping by doing these kinds of interventions in developed markets. So, Parmesh, you want to cover the?
Sure. So I think just want to wrap up now because we have taken more time than usual. I think we should have planned this a little bit better, I think. So basically, World Bank now, we have demand from 29 countries to make the upstream investments in the policies, the data, the digitization, and all that. And I think those 29 countries are our first, set of countries where we will do a lot of upstream analytics and also a lot of convening to make sure that we are creating an enabling ecosystem for investment as we go forward. And in some countries, we will do this jointly with IFC. And we are already discussing something in Africa, a kind of a joint upstream work, which we are going to do together. But there could be other countries also where we could do some work together. But we also are trying to, so our vision is now to work with the 100 best startups globally, basically. And we are trying to develop an innovation accreditation facility for that, which allows us then to systematically bring those innovations which are already proven to take them to the next level. And that's where we have to do with people who are already vetted by venture funds and IFC and all, and see how we can help them go to scale, basically, because the scale is still an issue. I think only 2% of the smallholder farmers are currently covered through digital and data-driven approaches. So we need to do a little bit more and be more ambitious on how we can unlock that there together. And we will, so there will be a lot of joint work with IFC, which we are working on. And so I think in next 2-3 years, we will see a lot of upstream work, a lot of joint work. And we will also build partnerships with organizations in countries which are regionally specific funds and specific donors who are working on that. So I'll stop there. And Martin, over to you. Back.
Very good. Thank you very much, Abdul, Prasad, and Parmesh for this very comprehensive overview. I think the presentation is very clear. I mean, indicating the huge potential of data-driven and digital agriculture in many areas. It cuts across many areas. I think that's one. I think the presentation also makes very clear, I mean, that there's a strong business case, I mean, for a joint IFC World Bank approach. I mean, our interventions clearly complement each other. I think third is that based on the country classification, that whatever intervention we do, it needs to be tailored, I mean, to those country conditions. And I think the 4 strategic pillars that you presented provide an interesting menu, I mean, that can be applied, I mean, to different countries. And based on that, the exact division of role between IFC and the World Bank, I mean, can also be defined. I think there's huge interest, the country examples are demonstrating that huge interest by countries and governments. Data-driven and digital agriculture, putting that up in the dialogue also is good for business development when it comes to bank and IFC operations. And then finally, what I sense also is a lot of interest by the private sector to get engaged in this agenda, and to the extent, I mean, that the bank is kind of scaling up its attention and raising the bar on private capital mobilization targets. I mean, AgTech could also be a very interesting sector here to actually move forward on that. So those are a few takeaways that I have, I mean, from the presentation. Thank you very much. So let's now hand over or move to the next agenda item, which is the interventions from our discussants. And so I'm pleased to first, give the screen to Mark Khan, who is the managing partner of Omnivore, a venture capital firm based in India. So, Mark, the screen is yours.
Mute myself. You would think after 18 months I'd figured that out, but I can be a little slow sometimes.
We hear you very well now, and also kind of see you. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've known many people on this call for quite some time. Thank you, Parmesh. Thank you, Prasad. It's always good to see you. Thanks, Vivek, and others who've asked us to be here. So as context, Omnivore is an agritech VC. We have been operating in India for 11 years, which means we were doing agtech before it was cool. In fact, we did agtech for a long time before it was cool, when it was miserable and lonely and an uphill slog. And thankfully, in the last 5 years, we've really seen the sector that we helped build foundationally take off, and the visions that we had when we started Omnivore are becoming real in front of our eyes, which is very exciting. But we had a lot of patience before that. What I'd like to try to do today is give some perspective on the Indian agritech ecosystem. India has, outside of the developed world, probably the largest and most active venture ecosystem related to the transformation of agriculture. Some of that is simply a factor of size, right? India represents 1/6 of humanity, has 130 million smallholder farmers, and has an economy that is about a quarter agricultural. But it's also a function of the fact that India has one of the world's most vibrant startup and venture ecosystems. And it was only a matter of time before all of those young people and all of those VCs suddenly realized that there was more to venture capital than global software as a service and catering to the top 10% of the Indian consumers. Over the course of the last 5 years, there has been an awakening in the Indian venture capital ecosystem, a recognition of the half of the country that lives on farm. And as a result, this entire ecosystem, which was quite peripheral, is now seeing a tremendous amount of activity and liftoff. And in turn, we're starting to see some very significant impact on farm and throughout the value chain. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint to kind of give some context to this, and hopefully everyone finds that useful. Now, I absolutely loathe presenting like this, but please tell me if you can see my screen. Cool.
Yes,
so
go ahead.
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the perspectives that Omnivore has for looking at this ecosystem, which, to be clear, I think applies to much more than India. I think it applies to any smallholder agricultural economy where you're thinking about deploying agtech. We really look at our theory of change, our investments as driving agricultural prosperity, transforming food systems, and promoting climate sustainability in India. But in terms of the modes of action, we're focused on 4 major pillars. The first is increasing the profitability of smallholders in India, and you will note that I did not say productivity, because that is Green Revolution thinking, and it's been 40 years and we know better. And the idea here is to think of every farmer in India, all 130 million of them, as micro-entrepreneurs that have top line, bottom line, right, revenues and expenses, costs of financing, and what can we do? What can the portfolio companies that we back do to increase their top line, reduce their costs, lower their cost of financing, and result in more profits at the end of the season? So that is a big part of what the portfolio companies that we invest in do. The second relates to resilience, and I like to think of resilience this way. If you chat with farmers in rural India, even the wealthiest farmers are pushing their children out of agriculture, and the reason is the variability in incomes from year to year. It's simply the most stressful job in the world. There's no other job that has as much embedded risk as agriculture. And so the question then becomes, how can we reduce the risk? How can we make these farmers more resilient? And that involves financing and risk management solutions and insurance, but it also involves embedding these farmers into value chains that stabilize their incomes. The third area is agricultural sustainability. In India, right, this is going to be the bottleneck on the future of agriculture. I'm a big believer that India can be, in 20 years, an agricultural superpower akin to Brazil. But this is going to determine whether we get there or not. Can we reduce the amount of water? Can we fix the soil crisis? Can we reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're consuming, right? And can we reduce the wastage and spoilage throughout the system? And if we can, then the sky is the limit. And finally, because it deserves its own pillar, catalyzing climate action. India is both a major emitter, and agriculture is about 20% of India's climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but India is also one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the effects of climate change. So while we have to deal with mitigation of GHG emissions, we also have to make this system more capable, more adaptive, more resilient for the changes to come. And that means promoting climate resilience across agriculture and the food system as a whole, but it's also about increasing the area under sustainable and regenerative cultivation. This is one lens that we use to look at the ecosystem. This is another, and this is, so that is a lens that's very central to our theory of change. But when we think about agritech, and we think about agritech globally, we think all of agritech can fall into about 6 categories. This is our framework for thinking about deals. This is where we think it is, mutually exclusive and comprehensive, and depicts pretty much what everyone in the world is working on in one of these 6 categories. We like to think of this as 3 deep tech categories and 3 full stack categories. The full stack categories, right, meaning more, business models that stretch across the entire range of value capture, are farmer platforms and fintech, B2B agri-marketplaces, and farm-to-consumer brands. The distinction between these is fundamentally which customer is being served. So when we think about farmer platforms and fintech, we're talking about digital platforms that provide inputs, advisory, market linkages, extensions, storage, equipment, credit insurance, some mix of all of these. But the important point here is that the focus is on the farmer. The focus is on transforming the life of the farmer. Sometimes, right, you've got sales from these platforms going to food processing companies. But while that is where they monetize, the focus is on value creation at the farmer. B2B agri-marketplaces, right, while they source from farmers, drive their growth retailer and trader and middlemen, right, centric. And a good example here would be Twiga. Twiga sources from farmers. Think about what drives, what accelerates the growth of Twiga. It is growing the number of retailers on the platform, which in turn reach consumers. This is true of NinjaCart as well. And so B2B agri-marketplaces, while they support farmers, are retailer and trader and middlemen centric. And so that's how we think about the distinction there. And finally, farm-to-consumer brands, while they source from farmers, are consumer centric. They are fundamentally creating an offering for a consumer that has fresh, traceable food. These companies grow one consumer at a time. They create value for farmers, but they are consumer centric. These are the 3 full stack platforms that we see, not just in India, also in Kenya, also in Indonesia, globally. And then there are 3 deep tech themes that we see. One is what we call precision agriculture. These are technologies that help farmers raise their crop yields and optimize their resource utilization. The important point here is that they are working on farm. This includes robotics, drones, IoT, remote sensing, and automation. Post-harvest technologies are also deep tech, but they're not focused as much on farm. They're focused from the point of the farm gate onwards. They're bringing food quality, safety, traceability, storage, logistics, and food processing. They might work with farmers, but most of their value creation is from the point of harvest to the point of consumption. And then the final deep tech theme is this theme of agri-food life sciences, which are innovative biological products to facilitate sustainable ag, novel foods and ingredients that promote sustainable consumption, including alternative protein. There's a lot of innovation in this space, but it is essentially biological innovation, synthetic biology, and the like. When we think about where the Indian ecosystem fits across these 6 themes and with the framework that we use, you'll recognize a lot of companies. I've included companies that I know IFC has invested in and that, from earlier events where I've been invited are chatting with. So if we think about farmer platforms, this is Dehat, right? This is Arya, this is AgroStar. These are farmer-centric platforms that are helping farmers to make more money, fundamentally. When we think about B2B agri marketplaces, this is NinjaCart, this is Bijak, this is Waycool, sourcing from farmers, creating value for retailers, right? And in turn, eventually reaching consumers. When we think about farm to consumer brands, this is Licious, this is Country Delight, this is Clover, where we're invested with Excel. It's called the Deep Rooted Company now, right? It's the largest controlled environment agriculture company in India. Again, consumer-centric. Precision agriculture, you have crop in here. You also have Eruvaka and Tartan Sense from our portfolio, IoT, remote sensing, robotics. When we think about post-harvest, AgNext, IntelliLab, Stellapps, and agri-food life sciences is a bit of a challenging aspect of the ecosystem in India because there's actually very little deal flow here. For whatever reason, right, India punches above its weight in any digital technology, but there's still an innovation gap in life sciences in India that needs to be catalyzed. And that's something that Omnivore is starting to work on. We have a number of very early stage investments here that we're going to use to start building a thesis in the space. The third lens that we have is the lens of climate. And when we look at what's happening with respect to at the intersection of agri-tech and climate, we think it's four major themes: enabling climate smart production to reduce emissions, conserve resources, and lower the negative impact of climate change on smallholder farmers, enabling financing and risk mitigation, building efficient supply chain infrastructure, and promoting consumption of sustainable food and agricultural products. And so there's a climate lens to everything that's happening in agri-tech right now. And as mentioned, this is an ecosystem that has really started to grow in recent years. When we started in 2010-11, this was about $10 million of investment a year. In the last 12 months, we crossed 500 million. I think this year we'll cross 700 or 800 million. So this has begun to mainstream itself, right? To be clear, there are larger rounds, on a dollar basis that have gone into giants in Indian e-commerce than all of the deals, that have happened in our sector in a year. But there's the beginning of a liftoff and a real transformation and a increasing presence in rural India of all of these agri-techs working to make a better future. So that's what I wanted to share today. Very open to any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I mean, this was a very good presentation, and clearly, with India's ICT, track records and expertise and the importance of agriculture, as you say. I mean, clearly, your presentation very much reflecting that, India is a natural breeding ground for AgTech. And I think the various lenses that you presented is a kind of a clear manifestation of that. So thank you very much, Mark. Let me then go to the next, our next discussant. And I hope he has joined us now. This is Sander Jansen. He is leading the Digital Agricultural Hub, which is associated with the Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. So Sander, please come in with your remarks.
Thank you, Martin, and organizers. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I see you. I also see you very clearly.
That's very nice. Thanks for permission, Prasad, for the invite and joining you. I mean, to me, this was already really nice to learn how you are going about it as World Bank and IFC and how the connections are. And so congratulations on this deep dive. It looks really impressive how you structured that. So I think I'm very impressed with how you managed to structure these sort of complex interactions between agriculture, sector development, in IT and technologies, and the national situation. So I don't have a presentation like Mark, but I will just react a bit to what was presented and then talk a bit about the Digital Agri Hub. And I will try to keep it short so that you can also answer some of the questions that people asked in the chat on this. I think, what I really appreciated in what you told is how you do that. I mean, maybe that's very logical for you, but how you really take a country and sector specific approach. So this is extremely important in agriculture too. And that's, I think, often misunderstood in these sort of broad brush general approaches where we think that one solution that works somewhere will work everywhere, and while it often doesn't. And another point I think there that links to that is then to see how you do that in different countries and different sectors, thinking also, what the sector really needs. And I think that's also, I really like that in the presentation of Mark, to make these connections of what's needed in every place. And it might even go, into regions and countries which then have a great potential to transform their agricultural production and make these new connections. Now, I think there's a sort of joint challenge coming out to bring in more of the sort of the private sector next to what government investment is doing, but there also that to realize that some things will need to be organized at a government level to have a good data infrastructure for people to work with, to have data access as a sort of condition for all these innovations to succeed. I think that's also what we hear a lot back in our work. So and this mixing of how the private and the public sector can work together, and it's not will magically appear just by waiting for the private sector to do whatever it does. That's I think a very important thing, and I would maybe be curious, just as a challenge to you in thinking forward, what would be, how would this sector look like in 5 years? And what would then be the configuration a bit that we could foresee in a way that it could also help us to think a bit better how we place these investments or make these interventions locally. So we'll spend just 2 minutes on what we are doing. And Martin mentioned in my introduction that I'm leading the Digital Agri Hub. So if you go to digitalagrihub.org, you will see the initiative we are establishing, which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, FCDO, and USAID. And the idea is to create a repository or monitoring tool for digital solutions across low and middle income countries to really track all digital solutions, so it's more focused on the digital side of it, that have an impact on smallholder farmers, and find out what they are in each country. And I mean, in our vision, we hope that this will be a very useful tool for partners like the World Bank, but also investors like Mark, to find out which technology firms are active, what they are doing, how many people they are reaching. And was one motivation of especially the Gates Foundation to get into this, to know whether their programs are successful in reaching farmers at scale. I will just, if you go to digitalagrihub.org, there you can find more information, and you can also register for our launch if you haven't done so, which is happening on next Tuesday. And yeah, it's more information on there. So if you were interested, really good. We're really looking forward to see you there, and reach out to me or others by email. And thanks for the invitation again to Parmesh and Prasad.
Very good. Thanks very much, Sander. Okay, so with those interventions by our two discussants, let's open it up for Q&A. It's almost 10:15. I mean, but I propose that we extend this webinar till 10:30. I have time actually, and I hope you have time as well. Because I think the presentation and the interventions have been very rich. There are a few questions in the chat. One by Upumanyu Data has 2 questions. AgTech firms spend 70% of their time on data collection. Do they do data collection usually via survey methods, or do they also use remote sensing, for example, estimating yields via NDVI? Are AgTech firms also investing in providing technology for hydroponics and appropriate marketing value addition, given that so many of the beneficiaries have tiny land holdings? So that's one question. One question from Sabrina, whether the context of the work they're doing on CCM, a producer of egg lime in Mali, who from your team should we contact for follow-up? So clearly there's interest actually to apply this in West Africa. A question from Raman Ahuja. Prasad talked about crowding in private sector. What are some of the nudges that can be deployed to accelerate engagement by established agribusiness? So I think those are a few questions. So I hand it back to Prasad and Parmesh. I mean, to respond to those questions, but also any points that you want to respond to and react to what Mark and Sander have put forward. If that's okay?
Sure.
First over to you, and then Parmesh. And then after Parmesh, maybe Abdullah as well. Okay?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just respond to, let's start with Raman's question. I think this is exactly what we're trying to do, right? So, with large companies, they always think they can do it themselves, right? So, even though you do have technologies that are readily available that can be adopted. So this is actually something we're looking. And one of the reasons, for example, if you go to Latin America with significantly larger land holdings, generally speaking, companies have already adopted. These large companies. We work with Amaji, which is one of the largest agribusiness companies in Brazil. It's amazing what they're doing in terms of deploying digital and technology in their operations. So they use drones for spotting weed control for weed control, and they actually have John Deere with their Blue River acquisition have got this the planters and seeders and harvesters which have artificial intelligence built in to go to places where they should be going to administer either pest control or whatever it is that they need to do. So there are companies. These are companies that are already deploying some of these technologies, right? And sugarcane plantation in Brazil, they on soil improvement technologies, they're doing incredible things. So it's in many other markets. I think there's a general reluctance in terms of proof of concept. With these established companies, they think they can do it themselves, and it takes a while for them to move, frankly. But there are companies that are actually setting up separate. The large companies. Mark's ex-company Syngenta has its own group that deals with technology. Actually, we work with them on the investment side. Syngenta Ventures is a big investor in this space. We come across them in many companies, especially in developed markets and Latin America. So there are companies which are doing this, but the companies that we work with in emerging markets, I think they need a little bit of a push, and that push from our side comes from our advisory engagements. So where we actually, for example, with Olam, they're looking at deploying digital technologies, virtual reality headsets for their farmers in the cocoa supply chain in Indonesia. So we work with JICA to develop a program. We implemented a program with them to actually deepen that digital reach in their supply chains, in the cocoa supply chains, and improving productivity, traceability, and all that, right? So, and that requires a little bit more of an enlightened company, frankly, right? So my sense is that players like people like Mark should be talking to all these guys and evangelizing the use of technology a bit more. But you talk to many of these guys, they think they have the model right, and they think they can do it themselves to a large extent. But in reality, I don't think they have the mindset. That to me is more of a challenge than anything else, frankly. And there are companies that are actually hiving off their digital kind of. So Olam is hived off Jiva, for example, as a separate outfit. It's funded them separately. And incentivize them separately to see how they can actually develop models of smallholders in the technology sector. So I see that as a challenge for us, and that's one thing we're looking at actively to see how our mainstream companies can adopt technology, both from investments as well as from the advisory side. So we can have a separate conversation, Raman, on that, and I'm sure Mark will have ideas on this as well. The second one, I think, in Mali, I think it's on the advisory side, so we should talk about our Sahel, Martin. I think we're looking at Sahel as a joint effort. It's not just on soil acidity, but it's overall. I think it's got to do with climate resilience. It's got to do with water resource use. So it's a variety of things. So I think it'll be good to have a chat on that on a more comprehensive. And Richard Colback from our advisory side and our specialist is leading the effort on that. So please liaise with Richard on that. From at least, I think the question came from our IFC Mass Advisory, so I'm assuming that we can use Richard and I'm sure the bank side to I forget the bank's regional person there, but Sahel is an important region for both the bank and IFC, so we should be talking more actively on that. And the last one on hydroponics. it remains to be seen, right? So it's exactly that. Do you want to do higher value products using hydroponics? So you need to have a business model around hydroponics, which is probably more important. I think the technology is available. It's about how do you find a business? I think Mark referred to it in his presentation in terms of who pays for this. Are you building a business model around having I don't know whether it's the customer needs to bear the cost of something like this. So are you going to do higher value products, or are you just doing simple things? This is probably the question that comes in kind of indoor farming as well. What do you do with indoor farming? What kind of products do you produce? So I think it's an interesting proposition, but my sense is the business model will dictate how hydroponics and other technologies can be used. So Parmesh, you want to comment on anything else? And
there are a set of questions on the data side, which have come in basically because people are saying that are we using the remote sensing and lots of other tools which are there for integration. Actually, in fact, there's a webinar yesterday which happened on this, on how we integrate all the remote sensing solutions and others, to create it. But our approach has been that we need to create a data stack or a platform which is then used by a variety of people. But the issue is that how that gets commercialized. And now technologically, we have many things like confidential computing, encryption, which allows us to develop approaches which can be used by different set of people to develop products and services. We're also looking at some kind of, because there are a lot of data being collected from smallholders and that's resold to them at cost. So we are looking at data vouchers kind of a model whereby farmers will get data vouchers, and by the data which they are providing in lieu of that, they will get certain services. So we have to come out with some very kind of disruptive models on data there. But clearly, there is a question for Mark from my colleague Ashish, who asked that if there is competition or collaboration on agri data sets used by full stack companies, how can World Bank reduce cost of data collection and duplication among companies in this space? And the second question I have for Mark also is that what should we be investing in? World Bank, suppose we have almost like $1 billion investment going on in India. So what should we be investing as part of that investment to make Ag sector become like a $2 billion industry in near future? So what should we do to invest there? I'm asking you a question as well there. Okay. So Mark, over to you.
Sure.
If you can respond to some of these.
So hold on one sec. So Parmesh, actually that's very smart. Actually, you instead of responding to a few of the questions, you actually asked a question to Mark. But I mean, there is one question before I go to Mark that maybe you want to kind of think about and and respond to Parmesh, and that is, I mean, what technologies digital are most appropriate and most effective in FCV context. No, I think he has some examples of Liberia, so maybe you want to reflect a little bit on that before we go to Mark, and then Mark has somewhat more time to think about his answers.
Sure, Martin. I'm not trying to avoid the questions,
I know, but it's smart.
yeah. But I think clearly we are currently working in Sudan and conflict areas of Ethiopia, Somalia, lots of other places. We find that there are two trends we see there. One is this whole advisory services using WhatsApp, SMS, and all. It's during COVID, we find that almost the extension and advisory models built on WhatsApp has, quadrupled actually in there. We see that in Kenya, we see it in Ethiopia, any corner of the world, we see that has exploded like that. So I think we have to exploit that as a business model now, and how we will creatively use WhatsApp, which has got very low entry barriers, to convert that into an extension, price information, and kind of an advisory service methodology. That I find is in conflict areas going to be important. The second is the e-commerce part. I think even in Somalia, we have 7 e-commerce initiatives going on right now. So which is very striking to me that there is a lot of e-commerce going on food and agriculture in all conflict areas. So we have to look at more, I would call them, as Mark, you're saying, a micro entrepreneurship, bringing micro entrepreneurship and micro e-commerce firms now, which are going to be more localized, but work on using data and digital technologies to deliver products to consumers on one side and procuring from farmers on one side. So there is a possibility of a new types of investments in FCV, one on the market side from e-commerce, and the second will be from the advisory side, which would come in. And apart from that, we are also seeing something on the whole data being collected through satellites, because we think that ground models for collecting data from farm by farm are absolutely not feasible in conflict areas. So we need to creatively use the satellite data, and we are seeing that already happening in many countries. We are working in Chad right now, how to use satellite data to really come out with the best approximation of crops and all that, and also the digital finance part where the risk part is done there. So over to you, Mark.
Sure. Let me take a stab at a couple of these different things for a second. I think someone else is trying to speak, but if I were to
Mark,
Mark,
yeah. So I also have a question for myself. So I want you to cover also my question. So, and my question is, what I hear very often, from the private sector, and I think you're very well positioned, with your firm as venture capitalist. I mean, that financing is not the issue, that there's a lot of money around, and that the issue is lack of investable projects, okay? But from where you are sitting in India and presenting this whole array of possibilities and investments, so what's your take on that notion that we very often hear, from investors? So that's my question to you, Mark. Sorry.
Sure, I've got about 4 questions I'm going to tackle. I'm going to start with yours. So I think the lack of investable projects was true 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago, we started 10 years ago. And if you look at what we invested in everything that was good that came around. But the amount of deals that we saw, the amount of opportunities we saw, maybe 1 a week, and we would do 3 a year, right? Whereas now it's 500 a year. So I think there, and I don't want to, it's not just that the Indian agri-tech ecosystem has taken off. The entire Indian entrepreneurial ecosystem has taken off. It is a cultural shift. When I first moved to India in 2007, the most prestigious job that every bright student at an IIT or an IIM, the elite engineering and MBA universities, wanted was McKinsey for consulting, Goldman Sachs for banking, or HUL, Unilever, for people that wanted general management experience. Today, the best and the brightest start their own companies or join their 2 or 3 year senior alumni in early stage startups. There is a massive cultural shift with respect to entrepreneurship. And so I think as a result, when you hear these things, there's not enough projects, absolutely true, but looking backwards. Today, I am struggling, and I know every other agri-focused investor is struggling to, we're spoiled for plenty. There are so many things that we could possibly invest in. It's becoming, in that sense, more like our generalist peers, where we really have to be able to split hairs and see a lot of difference between the quality of the entrepreneur. It's not just a good idea in a space that's empty. So that's one point. And I think there are still, right, if I were to kind of look globally, I would say there are still places that don't have enough deal flow, right? So for example, and I hope everyone will forgive me for saying this, I think, probably at this moment right now, if I look at the African agri-tech ecosystem, it's like where India was 7 or 8 years ago. It's still a little bit early. I'm more bullish about Nigeria. There's definitely, some early good positive signs in Kenya, but the absolute amount of deal flow is still relatively smaller. And so I think you're going to hear that. But even in India, when we get outside of these digital and full stack models and look at life sciences, that's still a space that doesn't have, right, as many projects, as many opportunities as I would like. And so it's something that Omnivore is now working on to try to catalyze that space, because there's not enough entrepreneurship there right now, and we need to accelerate that. So that's what I would say with respect to your question. I think India right now, there is absolutely enough to invest in. I think it's only within specific niches where there isn't. I think in other markets, right, and you're seeing a comparable level of takeoff, for example, in Indonesia. I think other markets are still a couple years off from reaching that point, for example, a Bangladesh or a Nigeria or a Kenya, but I think they will get there in the next few years. Regarding the question, what can the IFC do? I'm going to very selfishly say back more sector-specific agri funds, you know, without necessarily saying us, but I definitely think, you know, the IFC has gone from being private equity focused to now being much more open to supporting emerging market venture managers. I think from legacy, there is, you know, I think there was maybe some issues in the past with sector specific, and I hope that going forward, sector specific VCs can partner with the IFC more regularly. I also think that direct investments in our market are tremendously helpful. You've already obviously started doing that. And I can only say that we hope that accelerates, but it definitely seems like things are heading in the right direction. I'm going to tackle two other questions, one regarding controlled environment agriculture and hydroponics, and the other regarding data. I actually, I will actually take a minor issue with the question about hydroponics, because I think the focus on hydroponics implies, right, implies kind of super high-end produce. And I actually want to take a step back. The entire vision of urban agriculture, right, is the idea of reducing the amount that crops travel to reach their final point of consumption. So if we think about aero farms and Plenty and these, you know, very large, well-funded American urban farming startups, the idea is to shift farming so you're not producing all of your lettuce in California, right, and to move it into, right, urban production close to the point of consumption. I think when you take that technology and bring it to India, you strip out the LED lighting, you strip out the climate control, and what you're left with are polyhouses. What you're left with are low-cost hydroponics. And I think there's tremendous opportunity, right, to use protected cultivation, to use controlled environment agriculture, you know, possibly with solar, to ensure that food security for fresh produce, right, is, you know, is insulated against all of this climate risk that we're now starting to stare down. And so while I think it's still early days, I think there's going to be a form of urban agriculture that doesn't look like LED lights in warehouses in Newark for emerging markets like India. I don't know if you heard me. My computer's starting to whistle, and I'm wondering if I'm still broadcasting well. Great. Okay. Final question was about data and whether there is collaboration or competition, and I think the answer is both. Certainly, many agri-techs, right? You know, there was that saying, you know, in the last decade that data is the new oil. Are building proprietary data sets, right, that they want to hold, they want to control, and they want to reap the benefit of. And there's certainly competition amongst different agri-tech startups for that data. But there are also collaborative efforts in India around this notion of an agri-stack, right, an agricultural equivalent of the India stack. That you know, if we think about the India stack, it was based on the mobile number, it was based on the national ID, the Aadhaar, right, and it was based on a public sector bank account. The idea that every person had a digital identity and a financial link to that digital identity and a link to communications in the form of their mobile phone to that identity. And so now there are efforts to build an agri-stack that then takes that India stack and layers on, right, what is the parcel of land that that person owns, but also what is the parcel of land that that person is cultivating, because it's not always the same thing. They might own land but not cultivate it. They might cultivate land but not own it. And then once you have that, you know, cadastral layer built, you can start layering on soil maps and all sorts of agricultural information. Right now, there are a lot of national efforts to kind of build this out by the center, by the states. You know, early days, it does seem like what the center is doing in India right now is, rather than partnering with startups, they're partnering with some of the largest companies in the world to do this. But I think there's going to be increasing pressure to open up that data set to more and more players. I think if the World Bank, if the IFC were working in that space and pushing in that space, I would say the biggest thing is to make that as open source as humanly possible, right? You don't want a situation where the entirety of that data set goes straight to Google and Microsoft from day one, right? You want to make sure that that is as open a platform as you can make it. I think those were most of the questions. Please let me know if I didn't answer anything.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mark. Very much appreciated. I think we can continue, but I think we need to bring it to closure because actually it's past 10:30 here. You know, I'm not going to summarize. I think, you know, the presentation and discussion. I already presented, you know, the 4 or 5 takeaways that I had of the presentation. So we can actually kind of think about it and how to move forward on that. What I think would be interesting is a follow-up. You know, I'm just looking at Prasad and at Parmesh and at Mark. So what I found very interesting is this kind of thematic lens that you provided on AgTech, you know, with those 6 kind of, you know, I mean, teams, you know, farmer platforms in fintech, precision agriculture, agri-food life science, the marketplace, post-harvest, and the consumer brands. Now those 6, you know, and then you presented actually a number of companies that are active in each of those segments. You know, what I think would be interesting, Parmesh, is that, you know, if bank projects support those different segments, okay, of AgTech, how would the components actually of those projects look like? You know, when they support farmer platforms at fintech, or when they support precision agriculture, and have some kind of best practice designs of those components, so that we can share that with the TARS teams, and that actually will speak to the private sector. You know, somebody like Mark. And therefore, then will also be kind of a good tool, I think, to kind of start thinking about private capital mobilization. It would be kind of a nice link of what the bank is doing in the design of its project to the various segments on which the AgTech is active. Just an idea, and I would be looking very much forward to that as a follow-up, and looking forward to having opportunities along those lines. So with that, let me bring this to closure with a big thank you to Abdul, Prasad, and Parmesh, as well as to Mark and Sander. And so thank you very much for your contributions,
Thank you.
presentations, the discussions, and thanks to all the participants, I mean, for your attendance, as well as the questions that you posed. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.